So hello everybody, I'm very happy to see you here. Today we have with us Kelly Jones. She's an associate professor in the Department of Human Dimensions of Natural Resources at Colorado State University. She applies microeconomic theory and methods to understand relationships between people, policy, and environment. Specific areas of interest include market-based conservation, forest and water conservation, and evidence-based conservation. She has active research projects in Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, and the Western United States. So we are very, very happy to have Kelly with us today. And this is, of course, one of the LAERE-EfD seminars, but today is also a We Need seminar. So we are very happy to have Maria del Pilar Lopez here with us, that she's the director of We Need, and she's going to help us with moderating the session from Kelly. So without further ado, let's give the word to Kelly, and welcome. Thanks for accepting our invitation, and we're very glad that you're here.
Great, thank you, Alejandro. So it's nice to meet you all, and thank you for the invitation to present. If you probably don't know me, I haven't been active in LAERE, but I am part of the EFD Forest Collaborative Working Group and also part of the We Need network. So I'm glad to be presenting on this day. And as Alejandro said, I'm at Colorado State University. I'm an associate professor, and a lot of my work focuses on forest conservation policy. And I've been doing a lot of work in Latin America, mostly Mexico and Ecuador, and starting some new research in Colombia. I was recently based in Bogota, the Universidad de los Andes, working with Maria Alejandra Velez, who some of you might know. But I'm going to present my research, some of my research on Mexico today in this presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. If you have any trouble seeing that, let me know. Get that set up. All right, just you can interrupt me if you don't see that, Alejandro, or anyone. And is it look good? Okay, perfect. So I've been working in Mexico for about 8 years now. Some of the collaborators are listed here as co-authors on the paper I'm going to present today. And most of our research is focused in Veracruz state in Mexico, looking at payments for ecosystem services programs and their impacts on ecosystem services and socioeconomic outcomes. But in the last year, as we all know, with the kind of restrictions on travel, we decided to start a project or a research paper that is using secondary data, so mostly remote sensing GIS data, to do an analysis on the same topic. And what we wanted to look at was the emergence and persistence of payments for ecosystem services or payments for watershed services programs in Mexico. So this is the first time I'm presenting kind of our results. So I'm definitely looking forward to any comments or feedback on today's presentation that you might have. So I'm sure that most of you on this presentation know what PES are, but just as a reminder, these are market-like or market-based conservation approaches where the beneficiaries of ecosystem services provide compensation to the suppliers of those ecosystem services. And this compensation is usually in terms of cash payments, but it can also be in-kind payments. And really, PES has kind of signaled this paradigm shift in how we incentivize the provision of ecosystem services. So moving away from more kind of command and control or regulatory policies to these kind of direct incentives for ecosystem service provision. And the spread of PES has been global, as this map illustrates from Forest Trends. There was a recent summary in 2018 that there are more than 550 PES programs around the globe. The most common type of PES programs are for watershed or hydrological services, what I'm going to be referring to as PWS. And there's been major growth in Latin America. So there has been a little bit of work done on this question of where do we see these PES or PWS programs emerging across the globe. The first kind of major literature paper on this was a theoretical piece in 2017. They really summarized the literature in terms of what are the socio-ecological enabling conditions of PES. And they came up with these 4 themes: biophysical, economic, governance, and social cultural conditions. and different enabling factors within those 4 themes that they concluded are really what are necessary for a PES type approach to emerge. Since that paper, there have been 2 empirical analyses asking the same question. One was looking at global cities. So they had more than 400 cities in their database, and they used a random forest model to understand what factors were correlated with where we saw payments for watershed services programs. And the kind of key results are summarized here. So they found that agricultural extent, which signaled kind of threat to a watershed, had a positive influence on PWS emergence. If there was a lot of land already protected in a watershed, that had a negative influence because they served as substitutes for one another. They found that the occurrence of drought had a positive influence on a PWS program being created, that the size of the city had a negative influence on emergence of PWS, that annual GDP growth had a positive influence, and that land tenure security had a positive influence on PWS emergence. There was also a recent paper done at a country level analysis. So this was only in the tropics. They looked at 64 countries, and they used logistic regression to understand which countries had a PWS program and which did not have a PWS program. And they had similar results to the Romelu and al. Paper, but also some different factors. So they found that having higher deforestation rates in the country had a positive influence on the use of PWS programs. Having higher flood occurrence had a positive influence. If there was higher water quality and quantity in a country, then that was a positive influence on emergence of PWS. Rougher topography, which is similar to slope, had a positive influence on PWS. And that population concentration and also land tenure security both positively influenced a country having a PWS program. So we have a handful of studies that have started to look at this question of where PES emerging on the landscape. And what my collaborators and I thought would be interesting was to look within Mexico. So while we have these global analyses, by looking within one country, we can control for a lot more of those emitted variable biases that happen in global studies. So luckily with Mexico, we have a PWS program that has been kind of rolled out across the country. So we can study the same PWS policy mechanism and see which areas in Mexico have adopted or created a PWS program and which areas have not. So we think this can add to that kind of global set of papers that I just reviewed. And then a second thing that we're able to do in this analysis that those global papers couldn't do is, in addition to looking at where PWS programs emerge, we also are able to look at where have those programs continued to exist, what we're calling persistence, versus where they've stopped operating, so the failure of those programs. And this kind of longevity of a program is really important for understanding the success, or really the return on investment of creating these programs. There are a lot of upfront investment in creating a PES program, but especially for PWS, watershed services or hydrological services are really a long-term kind of outcome from these programs. So we need a program to be in existence for a long time. So just to kind of go over the PES programs in Mexico, probably a lot of you have heard about the national PES program. It started in 2003. So in addition to Costa Rica, it was one of the first programs in Latin America to start. There's many modalities, but water is certainly a major focus of the national program. But the program that we're going to be focusing on today is what is known as Fondos Concurrentes, which I'm going to be referring to as matching funds PES, or local PES program. And so this started in 2008, and it's also being funded and being operated by the National Forestry Commission, CONAFOR, in Mexico. But what's different between the local and national program is that in the local program, CONAFOR matches the funding with a local counterpart. So CONAFOR will provide up to 50% of the financing, and then a local counterpart has to come up with the other 50% of the financing. There's similar things in terms of requiring clear and uncontested title as the national program. Another difference is that the local counterpart gets to set the exact cash payments made to upstream landowners, and this can help differentiate in opportunity costs across different regions in Mexico. So some of the goals of this matching fund PES is that you get greater participation in funding from local actors, and that the programs can be more responsive to local conditions, like I mentioned, with opportunity costs. So in terms of the dependent variable we're using in our analysis, we worked with CONAFOR to create a database of all the matching funds or local PES programs that have been created in the country between 2008 and 2019. So we used their contracts records to create this database on programs. And we decided to only focus on payment for watershed services programs. There were a few non-PWS programs in this matching funds program, specifically for biodiversity, but there were so few that we just decided to focus only on hydrological services. And so with this database, we're able to create two dependent variables, the one about emergence, so is there a PWS program or not? And at the programmatic level, there have been 145 of these matching funds PWS programs between 2008 and 2019. And then the other dependent variable about whether the program continues to operate or not. And because we have a data going through 2019, we wanted to make sure there was sufficient time to judge whether the program actually failed or stopped working versus whether it was succeeding or not. So we decided to use a cutoff of 2014 for this dependent variable of persistence. And that's based on the mean contract length of these matching funds PWS programs, which is 5 years. So because of that, if we stop in 2014, we can evaluate in 2019 whether that program was still in existence or not. So of that database, there were 90 of these matching funds PWS programs started by 2014. Of those 90, actually only a little over a third, so 37, were still active as of 2019. So this is at the program level, but to do our analysis, we discussed, how to create boundaries around these programs because there's no kind of GIS data, geographic data on where a program is. And we considered using the municipality level or the watershed level. And we decided to use the municipality level because that's really where we would be able to get socioeconomic data for our independent variables. So we take that programmatic database that I just discussed, and we map that to the 2,456 municipalities that were in Mexico as of 2008. So our two dependent variables at the municipality level become that we have 260 municipalities that had any PWS program as of 2019. And then for the question of persistence, having that cutoff of 2014 as a start date, we had 170 municipalities that had at least one PWS program by that date. And you'll see in the parentheses that I say that's for persistence and emergence. And that's because for the emergence research question, we do the analysis with both the full data set and also the data set that stops at 2014, just so we can compare across these two research questions. And of those 170 municipalities that started by 2014, only 50 municipalities still had an active PWS program by 2014. So those are our dependent variables. And then for our independent variables for municipalities, we looked to the two global analyses that I just discussed, and we tried to find comparable variables under these themes of biophysical, economic and socio-cultural, and institutional themes. So you can see that under biophysical, we have several indicators here of things like terrain ruggedness or slope, which helps proxy for opportunity costs, hydrological variables, including drought incidence, flood incidence, and water quality, deforestation, and then also agricultural land and pasture land, which help proxy for threats to forest and to watershed services. And then the expected sign on those, we expected that threats like deforestation and agricultural land would have a positive influence on the emergence and persistence of a PES-like program. Similar with terrain ruggedness, because this is kind of a proxy for opportunity cost, it would have a positive influence on these dependent variables. But for the hydrological variables, there was uncertainty in which way the sign would go, because we could have supply side factors mattering most. So you need to have an abundance of these watershed services in order for a location to invest in creating and maintaining a PES program. Or it could be that the demand side factors really matter the most, and that scarcity of these watershed services is what drives the creation and persistence of a PWS program. Under economic and socio-cultural, we have three variables. We have GDP per capita, and then we have a poverty index. Both of those are capturing kind of wealth in a municipality. And there's ambiguity in the direction of the sign because these are municipality level variables. So if it's picking up more urban wealth, then we're capturing more of that willingness to pay or ability to pay for these programs. if it's capturing more kind of the rural conditions of a municipality, it could be proxying more for willingness to accept or the opportunity cost of creating and maintaining these programs. Then we also had a variable capturing the number of localities and cities in a municipality, again, with some ambiguity depending on if those population concentrations are more in urban areas or rural areas. And then under the institutional factors, we don't have a measure of tenure security like the global analyses had, but there are different tenure forms in Mexico, and we know that there's different amounts of PES associated with those tenure forms. A lot of PES is going to a collective or a ejido land in Mexico. So we hypothesized that the percent of private lands within a municipality would have a negative influence on the emergence and persistence of PES. And then we also included protected areas and the national PES program, the percent before 2008. These two both have kind of ambiguity with the dependent variables, and that's because they could act as substitutes for the local PES program. So you would expect to then see a negative influence on PES, or they could have a positive influence if watersheds are investing in both programs, or in the case of the national PES program, it's actually leading to kind of institutional capacity or social capital to then establish a local PES program. The Watersheds and Cities program is unique to Mexico. This was created in 2001 by an NGO, and it was specifically about building the capacity of cities in Mexico to protect their watershed resources. So we thought this capacity building program, having that in a municipality, would have a positive influence on the creation of a PES and the persistence of it. And then finally, the last variable is specific only to our dependent variable on persistence, because this is a program level variable. So we were able to piece together who was the local counterpart that signed the contract with CONAFOR and provided the funding, the other 50% of the funding in the matching PWS program. So we have 5 dummy variables on who the counterpart was. So it could be the state government, the municipality government, an NGO, the water utility, or a private firm. So in terms of data analysis, this is the regression equation for our dependent variable on PWS emergence. So this is cross-sectional municipality level data. We're including all 14 covariates in this regression, and then we're running it with and without a dummy variable for ecoregion. There's 7 ecoregions in Mexico, and this just helps us capture for additional potential emitted variables, especially those hydrological and ecological variations across the country that might lead to the emergence of a PES program. So we use logistic regression, and we use backward stepwise regression with a 90% cutoff to see which of these 14 covariates are correlated with the presence of a PWS program. We're going to report the odds ratios here and robust standard errors, and we're going to do this regression with both the full sample, so all programs that started by 2019, and also just the 2014 sample, so we can compare it with that persistence regression. In terms of data analysis for the second dependent variable, persistence, similar regression equation here. Again, it's municipality level data. We're going to use all 14 covariates to see what's correlated with persistence. We have that ecoregion dummy variable, so we'll run the regression with and without it. And then we additionally have those 5 dummy variables representing the local counterpart in this persistence regression. Again, this is a logistic regression. We use that backward stepwise regression for the 14 covariates and report the odds ratios and robust standard errors. And this is just for those municipalities that had a PWS program start by 2014. So here I'm just showing you the means or averages for those independent variables for PWS and non-PWS municipalities. So I'm not showing you the t-test or difference in means test here, but even with the difference in samples, you can see some differences across those municipalities that ever had a PWS versus those that never had a PWS program. So for example, PWS municipalities had more terrain ruggedness. They had lower rates of deforestation, but they had similar in their hydrological or watershed conditions to those municipalities that don't have a PWS program. We find very little difference in agricultural land, but we do find that those municipalities with a PWS program have less pasture land. We find that municipalities with PWS have higher GDP per capita. And while poverty rates are pretty similar across both types of municipalities, there are more localities and cities in municipalities that have PWS programs. We also find that these PWS municipalities have a lower percent of private land tenure. They have a lot more natural protected areas. They have a lot more of the national PES program, and they're more likely to have had that watersheds and cities capacity building program I talked about than non-PWS municipalities. So that's just showing you the raw kind of differences and means across these two groups. And we'll look at the regression results for the first dependent variable on emergence. So this is showing the logistic regression results for the full sample. So this includes those 260 municipalities as a 1 if they ever, because they had a PWS program, comparing it to all the other municipalities that never had a PWS program. And the odds ratios here, if the value is greater than 1, then it's a positive influence on emergence. And if it's less than 1, it has a negative influence on the emergence of PWS. So what do we see here? And these two models represent without the ecoregion dummy variable and with the ecoregion dummy variable. So terrain ruggedness had a positive influence on where we see PWS programs emerging. Deforestation rate had a negative influence on where we see PWS programs emerging. For the hydrological variables, we didn't find any statistical significant relationship between them and PWS emergence. Agricultural land is statistically significant in the model without the ecoregion dummy, but then becomes insignificant. Our socio-cultural and economic variables, so GDP per capita, poverty in cities, were statistically significant. We see that poverty had a negative relationship with PWS emergence, but the number of cities or localities had a positive influence. And then all of our institutional variables are statistically significant. The presence of private land tenure had a negative influence on where we see PWS programs, but the presence of protected areas in the national PES program had a positive influence on where we see PWS emerge, as well as this watersheds and cities program, at least when we don't include the ecoregion dummy. So I'm also just going to show you quickly the results for the 2014 sample, just to look for consistency. Of course, this is only 170 municipalities that had a program by 2014 versus 260 in the full sample. So definitely different sample size here, but we see some consistency in terrain ruggedness having a positive influence on PWS emergence, deforestation having a negative influence on it. GDP per capita is statistically significant, but the odds ratio is really small, so not doing a lot. Cities having that positive influence on having the program, and then these institutional variables being strongly statistically significant and consistent with tenure, private tenure having a negative influence, protected areas in the national PES and this watersheds and cities program having a positive influence on where we see the PWS programs emerge in Mexico. So we'll turn now to the persistence question. So that was our first dependent variable emergence. The second one is, of the 170 that started by 2014, how many were still in existence and why were they still in existence? So here's that two models, the one without the dummy variable for ecoregion, the one with it. I'll show you the results for the counterpart dummy variables on the next slide. So in terms of the 14 independent variables that were included in both regressions, what do we see matter for persistence? Well, we see that terrain ruggedness and deforestation are no longer statistically significant, at least across both models. We see that some of the hydrological variables become statistically significant when understanding where do PWS programs succeed versus where do they fail. Specifically, the number of flood incidences has a positive influence on the persistence of a PWS program, and water quality in here, what is picking up is poorer water quality has a positive influence on the persistence of PWS programs. We see here that agricultural land has a negative influence. So the extent of agricultural land has a negative influence on where we see PWS programs succeeding over time. We don't see many of the economic and socio-cultural variables statistically significant here. And then in terms of the institutional variables, we see that it's natural protected areas that remain statistically significant with a positive influence on persistence. And then private tenure is statistically significant in one of the regressions, as is the watersheds and cities program. I did summarize here because I'm sure you don't remember exactly what was going on in the last slide in terms of what was statistically significant. But if we compare that dependent variable of emergence for the 2014 sample and this dependent variable on persistence, we can look for what's similar and what's different in terms of the independent variables. And I think what's most interesting is what changes. And so we see that there were 3 variables that were not important for explaining the emergence of PWS, but become important in explaining persistence. So those are that flood incidence, water quality, and agricultural lands. And then there are a couple of variables that were important to explaining the emergence of PWS, but that don't seem to be correlated with whether or not a PWS program succeeds over time. So that was deforestation rate, the number of cities and localities, and presence of that national PES program. So the next slide is going to show you the counterpart variables, which again are independent variables only for the persistent dependent variable. They were included in Model 5 and Model 6. I'm just showing them on a different slide just for you being able to see everything because of the size of the text. So here are those same Model 5 and Model 6, and this is just the coefficients for the counterparts. These are 5 dummy variables. So what we see is that when we don't include the ecoregion dummy variable, 4 of the 5 counterparts are statistically significant. They all have a positive influence on persistence, but we see that the ones that have kind of a more robust p-value and that have a larger odds ratio are the NGO variable and the water utility variable. And then if we move to Model 6, where we do include that ecoregion dummy, we see that the only 2 counterparts that remain statistically significant are the NGOs and the water utility. So both of these counterparts have a large positive effect on PWS programs succeeding over time. Okay, so I'm going to now kind of discuss those results, and then I'll turn to some of the policy recommendations based on those results. So in terms of our findings around the emergence of PWS in Mexico, we find that having rougher topography has a positive influence on PWS. So you can think about this as kind of slope. And our finding is in line with what the national level study done by Bosch et al. Found around PWS emergence. And what we think that signals, right, is that PWS are going to these lower opportunity cost areas, so they're not going to be as productive for, say, agricultural uses. In our study, we found that a lower deforestation rate before 2008 had a positive influence on where we see PWS programs emerge. This is opposite of that national level study done on PWS emergence, but it is in line with what we've seen in terms of impact evaluations of Mexico's PES program, which have found low additionality, and that many of the parcels of land that are enrolled in the PES program had lower risk of deforestation. We find that the extent of agriculture or pasture land is not correlated with PWS emergence in Mexico. That city level analysis did find that those threats were correlated. So this is an opposite finding. And then we also find that hydrological variables are not correlated with PWS emergence in Mexico. And again, the other 2 global analyses did find some relationships between these watershed service variables and PWS emergence. In terms of economic and social-cultural variables, we found that higher GDP per capita positively influenced the emergence. That's a typo there. It influenced the emergence. And so that is similar to the city level analysis that was done on PWS emergence. And we think then that that's capturing kind of this urban ability or willingness to pay for PES programs. We found that poverty had a negative influence on PWS in Mexico. This variable was not included in the 2 global analyses, but similar to the variable above it, we think it's capturing kind of that willingness or ability to pay for these programs. The presence of cities and localities in Mexico had a positive influence on PWS, and this is similar to the national level analysis by Bosch et al. The Romelu et al. Paper, which was at the city scale, did not find that population had a positive influence on PWS. And then institutionally, again, we used tenure form, and we found that having more private land tenure had a negative influence on PWS emergence. And this is likely explained by the fact that ejido lands are more likely to be enrolled in PES programs in Mexico. I mean, both from the operator perspective, which having the ejido lands lowers transaction costs, and also there have been studies showing that many of the ejidos have non-financial motivations. There is just a relationship between that collective land tenure and PES in Mexico. We found that protected areas had a positive influence on where we see PWS in Mexico. This is opposite of that city level analysis, but is supported by Mexico's policy of overlapping these two programs. And so there's been a lot of PES targeted to protected areas in Mexico to help compensate for the cost of conservation for people living within these protected areas. We found that the national PES program had a positive influence on this local PWS emergence. And this is likely because having that national program provided information and knowledge about these programs and built capacity around these type of economic incentive programs, which helped create or have a PWS program emerge at the local level. And then that Watersheds and Cities program, that capacity building program, had a positive influence on PWS. And likely that was because it helped build capacity and institutional strength downstream for local operators to create a local PWS program. Turning to persistence, in terms of the biophysical theme, we found that the topography and deforestation rates were not correlated with persistence. So possibly, low opportunity costs help drive PWS emergence in Mexico. But once a program started, it doesn't really differentiate across municipalities which ones succeed and which ones fail. We find that agricultural extent was negatively correlated with persistence. And so possibly at some threshold of agricultural land, if you have a PES program operating, they can't succeed. Maybe they can't meet the opportunity cost of landowners to get enough people enrolled in those programs. Hydrological variables, interestingly, while they didn't matter to emergence, they did matter to persistence. And we found that having more incidents of floods and poor water quality had a positive relationship with where PES programs are succeeding in Mexico, which suggests that some of these demand side factors, kind of scarcity of hydrological services, is important for maintaining a PES program in your locality. In terms of economic and social-cultural theme, we found that none of these variables were strongly related to persistence of PES. So while they did matter for emergence, it might be that willingness to pay or ability to pay is sufficient to get a program operating, but it's not as important for differentiating where a program succeeds. Now, one caveat to that is we're not considering how a program grows over time or changes. We're just looking at whether it starts or stops. In terms of the institutional variables, it really was just that protected area variable that stayed positively correlated with persistence. And this is likely related to Mexico's policy of overlapping PES within protected areas. Those other institutional variables were not statistic, at least across both models, that with the ecoregion dummy and without it. And so it might be that while you really need good institutional conditions for PES programs to start or emerge, once you have that kind of baseline level of institutional strength, then they can persist, right? There's not an additional amount of institutional strength needed for some to succeed versus having some fail. And then finally, that counterpart variable was really important to the persistence of a local PWS program. And we find that NGOs in particular have a really large and positive influence. One reason for this, there's been a lot of literature on the role of NGOs as intermediaries in PES, is they're often locally situated, they understand the local context, and they're politically neutral, so they're often a preferred operator of PES programs. We also found that water utilities had a large positive influence on whether or not a PWS program succeeded over time. And one reason for this might be that a lot of the water utilities, if they're the local counterpart, are able to raise funding for these PWS programs by adding a tariff to water bills. So they have more sustainable financing than some of the other counterparts. And in general, we found that these decentralized counterparts, these non-state actors, were more likely to be associated with the persistence of these local PWS programs. And one reason for that, potentially in Mexico, is that when there is political turnover after election, it's often common for politicians to deactivate programs that were started by the person before them. So that might influence the ability of a PWS program to last over several cycles of political elections. So we also reached out to Conifor because, of course, this is just a secondary data analysis. And of course, there might be some factors that we can't capture with this type of GIS data that explain emergence and persistence. So we asked Conifor what they thought were the main factors that influence which municipalities had a PWS program and were able to succeed in maintaining it. And they gave us a list of 3 factors. And some of those we think we're able to kind of at least proxy for in our secondary regression analysis. So they mentioned financial resources, so the ability for the counterpart to leverage and efficiently allocate funding, which is of course critical to any PES program. So some of the variables we have in there that capture this idea are GDP per capita and our poverty index. And also this water utility counterpart, as I just mentioned, might kind of proxy for the ability to really leverage funding sustainably. A second factor that Conifer mentioned was social capital, that there needs to be the organizational capacity of local users to do this type of PES program, so having collective action. And there's been some research in Mexico by Alex Pfaff and others that show that having kind of trust and strong social capital leads to more successful creation of these local PES programs. So to proxy for that in our study, we do think that presence of the Watersheds and Cities program, which is a capacity building effort, and also having the national PES program serve as proxies for kind of the institutional capacity to establish a local PES program in those municipalities. And then thirdly, Conifer mentioned non-financial motivations, specifically environmental motivations, as important to where they see these matching funds programs emerging and persisting. And they said it happened both at the landowner scale, especially the ejido landowners pressuring the municipality to start one of these programs, and also within the counterpart groups, having people in those groups, whether it's an NGO or some other type of counterpart that had environmental motivations to create these programs. So we don't have any specific secondary variables that really capture this idea of non-financial motivations, but there's been some good work recently in Colombia and in the Western US that show that these non-financial motivations of the counterparts is an important factor driving PES emergence. So to conclude and kind of just talk about the implications of our findings in terms of that emergence of PWS, our study and also the two global studies that I talked about really show that PWS tend to emerge in these lower opportunity cost areas, which signal that there could be lower additionality of these programs. And we've certainly seen that in some of the impact evaluation work in Mexico. So the recommendation that's always given is, we need to use higher payment amounts to match the opportunity costs in different areas if we want to use these type of financial incentives to protect hydrological services. A second conclusion is that in Mexico, we're finding that it's really the municipalities that have more ability to pay that we see the PWS programs emerging. So this does signal that there could be some equity concerns on where we can get PWS in Mexico. So one recommendation, especially for the Conifer program, is that there could be differentiated amounts of funding given to municipalities based on their ability to kind of match the 50% that Conifer is giving them, or there could be some type of tiered approach where more money is given up front to municipalities to start these programs, and then that amount is reduced over time once the local counterpart can raise the funding. The third conclusion is that institutional capacity is key for PWS emergence, and that is a study or kind of a finding that we've seen globally for PES programs. So one recommendation for Mexico or any country really is that if we want to see more of these local types of user-operated PWS approaches, we really need to invest in capacity building at the local level. So that Watershed and Cities program is one example of how that could be done. And then in terms of persistence of PWS programs over time, we found that the poorer hydrological conditions, so the more flood incidents, the worse water quality, were correlated with the continued support for PWS programs. And we don't know exactly why that is, but it does suggest that having more monitoring of hydrological metrics and dissemination of that information, especially to downstream users and beneficiaries, could help increase the support for these programs over the long term. And then secondly, we find that decentralized actors, if they're involved as the counterpart, so they're involved in funding the program and operating the local program, that has a large impact on the continued operation and success of these PWS programs. So one recommendation is that non-state actors be required to be involved in at least Mexico's program for this matching funds PWS. And with that, I think I am done. So I'm going to stop sharing and take any questions that you might have or suggestions or feedback.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you for the great presentation. Now we open the floor for questions. So if you have any question, you can actually raise your hand and then unmute yourself and ask the questions to Kelly. I don't know. Alejandro has one question. Perfect.
Yes,
Alejandro, go ahead.
Thanks, Maria del Pilar. So while people think their questions and stop being a little bit shy, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a couple of things to Kelly. So one has to do with the drought and flood. Well, mostly with the drought incidents. I saw that this a dummy that you have there. So can you explain a little bit how you created that, and if you tried, playing with how that variable is constructed? Because I'm thinking that the intensity of the drought might be an issue, or how many years you had a drought during consecutive years. All those kind of things could factor in the decision. So I wanted to see a little bit how you did that. And I was wondering if there is a way to kind of control, include a variable where you have information, but probably you don't. But if you have information about if the protected area stopped because the community wanted it to stop, or because the counterpart ran out of money, right? So those could be like two different issues, right? I mean, or in all cases is because there was no money anymore. No, I imagine in some cases the community didn't want to participate anymore. So in this issue of persistence, if there is some way to differentiate between who made the decision of stopping the participation in the program.
Thanks, Alejandro. I'll start with that second question first. So who made the decision? You're right. We don't have information on that in terms of was it that landowners upstream weren't participating, maybe the payments weren't high enough, right, to incentivize people, or if it was downstream and they weren't able to sufficiently raise money and allocate that money efficiently. We're actually going to be meeting with CONAFOR next week and presenting the results. So I would certainly ask them, like, just anecdotally, what they've seen. I would guess, just on the discussions we've had with them, it's the latter. There's the counterparts not being able to find enough funding and to sustain that funding over time. I know, at least, again, kind of just one example where we've been working in Veracruz is that one of the cities we've been working in, they have this water tariff on the water bill, and it helps pay for the local PS program. But in the neighboring town, Jalapa, they're not able to do that because people are so concerned with corruption and where the money's going that they've just refused to pay those water tariffs. And so they haven't been able to fund that program. They've had to bring in an NGO to fund the program. So I'm guessing it's the latter, but I will actually ask them because I don't know like what their opinion is on that. Your first question about the dummy variables, that's a great question. We struggled a lot with finding good hydrological data for Mexico. So there's really good coverage in some places, but not across the whole country. And we ended up deciding to go with this variable, as you mentioned, which is about, let me see if I can actually pull that paper up real quick. Yeah, which is on the reported incidents. So it's actually not, it's a social variable in that it's people reporting that there was a drought or a flood at the municipality level, and their disaster declarations. So we talked about, that the pros and cons of that, right? Because there could be political reasons to say that you've had more disasters, but because we couldn't find good hydrological data, we went with that. And we did look at, so it could be technically a limited continuous variable because there could be more than one, of course, reported disaster. But when we looked at kind of the distribution of that, it tends to kind of really center around one. So it's really skewed. And we looked at putting it in as a continuous variable and we weren't finding any effect. And so then I started and I did the dummy variable and I did some other cutoffs. And it was only with the dummy variable where there was any reported incident versus none that we found any relationship in those regressions. So that's kind of why we're working with that variable.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any other question, people here. Oscar is asking a question. Have you considered to use climate change adaptation variable in your analysis?
Hi, Oscar. That's a good question. I don't know what that would look like in terms of if there's a variable available or data on that. If you have any ideas of data sets you've used, or we could certainly consider it. We looked at including things like temperature, precipitation. We ended up not including those just because, especially with the ecoregion dummy variable, we're kind of capturing some of those gradients in Mexico with it. But I don't know specifically. Yeah, we haven't really talked about climate change adaptation or kind of climate change itself. I don't know if anyone else here has used anything like that.
Pablo, you have a question? Go ahead.
Hi, yeah. Thank you, Kelly. Just a quick, I was just wondering when I was listening to your presentation, if you have considered doing like a dynamic model in the sense that you can do a similar thing to what you have, even have a cross section and setting, the time of adoption to be like period T0, and then, T-1, T-2, T-3 will be just before the inaction of the PWS program. And then you can capture all these, droughts, you have a very hot year, if you have, very little rainfall or something like that, more precisely, I would say. So yeah, just wondering about that.
Yeah, no, great question. No, we certainly looked at that, and I think would be the next step, and kind of decided to start with the kind of more simplistic binary regression, and then see if we could move on to something like a dynamic model in the future as a next step. So I haven't used it myself, so I had to go see what kind of data, because there's not a lot of annual data or panel data available on a lot of the variables we're using. So that would be the one limitation, I guess, to get that variation, because a lot of it's kind of census data. So it comes out like every 5 years or so in Mexico. But it's something we want to explore after we kind of get this out. So thanks for that suggestion.
And I also have like a question. If when you try actually the dummy versus non-dummy variables, you find that there are different effects. Do you think that this actually saying something, like, when you actually test for extensive versus intensive margin, perhaps that is actually suggesting something different? And then the other thing that I was gonna ask is, when you try to include other variables, other geographical variables, like when you were mentioning temperature and all this, probably they're not changing a lot. But sometimes what we use is actually deviation from the mean, right? So it's not really like the temperature or the precipitation. It's more like how it's deviated from the mean in a particular year in a particular municipality. Have you also tried this?
We did not look at deviation from the mean for temperature precipitation, so that would be interesting. And again, I'd have to go back and look at how often we have that data for. In terms of years. One of my co-authors is the GIS expert, so he was doing all that part of the data. But yeah, it's definitely worth looking for. I definitely think the ecoregion dummy is doing some of that, but I think if we could get a municipality level, that would be good. And then your first question, I'm not sure if I understand exactly. So in terms of the dummy variables, are you talking specifically about like the drought and flood variables in terms of what?
Yeah, for example, it's different to actually include if one municipality have a drought or a flood 1 year, that he have 10 or 12. So I think it's actually following Alejandro's question. So if you actually find different results when you include a dummy and when you actually include the number of events, I think that is all saying something about the intensive and extensive margin of the situations that you're actually.
Definitely. And I'll go back and look. So we used 2000 to 2008 because we're trying to capture pre-program incidents. And I think 2000 was the first year that the data were available. But from my remembrance, like I said, I think there were no more than 10, right? So it wasn't that we had some municipalities reporting 100 or 1,000. It was actually a very kind of small number. And there was no statistical significance when we used it like 0 to 10. And so that's why I ended up, and I tried, I think, at least one where it was like 3 different, numbers, and tried to like have kind of a scale. But I think the 0 and 1 is the only place we saw it. So, I mean, all that's picking up, right, is either none or some, right? And that's all we can say. So if there was any reported flood within that time frame. So there's certainly a limitation in those variables. And we've tried a lot of hydrological variables, but
I'm really surprised. I don't know the Mexico data, but I'm really surprised that actually Mexico doesn't have great data on this. I mean, in Colombia, we have amazing data on this. I'm really surprised, but we always, think that Mexico actually, I mean, their data is great. So I'm a bit surprised. But anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, and the water quality is the only one we don't have as a index, is actually the hydrological variable. But even that one, I'm looking at my table, there were only 4,000, there's only 4,000 sites across Mexico where they do that. So we had to interpolate that data, right, for the whole country, and then, take those point data and then convert it into some type of interpolation. So even with that, we were pretty limited. So I don't know what the answer is, why that is. I agree with you. I'm usually like, Mexico has amazing secondary data sets, which is why we started this process, but not a lot of watershed services, apparently. Yeah.
Great. I don't know if there is any other questions. Well, it looks like we're done then. Kelly, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think you're my neighbor in my office, so I hope to see you next time that you're around. And great to see you all. And I mean, we'll see you in 2 weeks, I think, 3 weeks, for our next seminar.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Maria del Pilar. Bye. See you.